Great. Thank you for joining the Committee on House Administration for our roundtable discussion titled Ushering the U.S. Copyright Office into the Modern Era. The goal of this event is to have a bipartisan discussion between committee leaders and copyright stakeholders on how current Copyright Office modernization efforts are advancing and suggestions for other areas of improvement. Our roundtable discussion will last 1 hour. Please stay afterward for refreshments. I have the honor of introducing the host of today's event. Chairman Brian Stile has represented Wisconsin's 1st Congressional District since 2019. Chairman Stile is a problem solver with extensive private sector experience who puts politics aside and focuses on issues impacting Wisconsin and the country. He is focused on making the American dream achievable for everyone and has been at the forefront of supporting investment in small businesses and creating opportunities for wealth creation. Ranking Member Joe Morelli, who represents New York's 25th Congressional District, has served in Congress since 2018. A lifelong resident of upstate New York, Ranking Member Morelli is a former small business owner and was previously elected to the Monroe County Legislature and served as Majority Leader of the New York State Assembly. Throughout his career, Ranking Member Morelli has worked diligently to improve and expand access to health care, grow our economy, and protect our communities. Thank you both for leading our roundtable discussion. I will now turn it over to the chairman.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thanks for everybody for being here. Ranking Member Morelli and I have had a lot of conversations about kind of what we could do with the oversight over the Copyright Office. I think there's some real opportunities here, and wanted to bring you in to provide your insight and feedback. Instead of setting this up in a formal congressional hearing, although Mr. Morelli and I are seated at the witness table, usually facing the other way, so new respect for our witnesses. But to really instead to sit down and have a true conversation and a dialogue about where we're at and where we need to go in the Copyright Office as we look at emerging technology, as we look at true opportunities to strengthen creative development here in the United States. I think we can talk today a little bit about the registration process, the recordation process, and where the office has an opportunity for improvement from a user standpoint, where we can strengthen the process for copyright in the United States. I'd like to touch later on some of the fees and the aspects of how that's impacting the Copyright Office. As we know, the Copyright Office is funded both by a fee structure and by Congress, and the impact that has on U.S. creative development. In the deposit requirements, the physical copies, and the most recent D.C. court case impacting that just a handful of weeks ago. I'll let Mr. Morelli speak and introduce half of our panel as well, but maybe allow you to do opening remarks, then we'll introduce the panel and dive right in to a discussion.
Thank you. First of all, to my friend and partner, Chairman Stile, for convening the roundtable and doing it in a bipartisan fashion. This committee has a long history of bipartisanship in terms of administration, a number of issues, and this is certainly one that we're anxious, and I do want to thank not only you, but your staff who've taken a really collaborative approach to all of our modernization work, but particularly what brings us here together today and working to guide the Copyright Office through its continued modernization efforts. I want to thank all of you for joining us. One of the great advantages of being on this committee, in particular all committees in Congress, but this one in particular, is the ability to interact with so many smart and thoughtful people and subject matter area experts on sometimes vastly different fields, but critically important ones. So, and that continues today, and we're grateful for you being involved. I think I'm particularly interested in just learning generally. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm grateful to all of you, but learning about how the already introduced elements of the new enterprise copyright system are working, and what other types of modernizations you'd like to see implemented going forward. Also interested in your thoughts on what, if any, congressional response there ought to be to the last month's decision by the D.C. Circuit Court relative to certain applications of the Copyright Office's mandatory deposit requirement, and the question about it violating the takings clause. So copyright, as the chairman and I have talked about, touches so many different parts of our lives and significant parts of the national economy. So while we're certainly interested in not only making sure that the copyright process is as easy as it is for people who are creating content, but also making sure it's efficient on the end of the Copyright Office, but being thoughtful about how important this is to the nation's economy and all the people who participate in the space. So just looking at the Writers Guild and what's happened there, we hopefully that's a positive sign, but one of the big issues is around who owns and who gets to, make economic advantage of creative work, and how AI and other things impede that or impact it at least. So I'm really grateful to have all of you here, and again, thank you, Chairman Stile, for pulling us all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morelli. We'll just begin by very brief introductions of the panel. You guys have robust resumes, but to keep this so we don't spend the whole time on introducing our panel, we've shrunk it down a bit, but I want to start with Todd Carpenter, who serves as Executive Director of the National Information Standards Organization. And in this role, Mr. Carpenter leads the development of U.S. national standards for the publishing, library, and software vendor industries. Susan Chertoff is the Senior Vice President, Legal and Regulatory Affairs for the Recording Industry Association of America, where she worked since 2000. Members are regular users of Copyright Office services. She has followed and submitted written comments on issues involving Copyright Office modernization. Brewster Kahle is the founder of the Digital Librarian of the Internet Archive, one of the largest libraries in the world. The Internet Archive, founded in 1996, preserves data, the books, web pages, music, television, and software of our cultural heritage, and works with more than 1,100 libraries and university partners to create a digital library accessible to all. Roy Kaufman is Managing Director of both Business Development and Government Relations for the Copyright Clearance Center, which provides collective copyright licensing services for users of copyrighted material. He also has written and lectured extensively on the subject of copyright, licensing, open access, artificial intelligence, new media, and artists' rights. And I'll ask Mr. Morelli to introduce our four other panelists.
Very good. Keith Kupferschmidt, did I do that all right, Keith? Good, thank you. Is President and CEO of the Copyright Alliance, and an organization that represents the interests of creators, and in this role has testified before Congress and various federal and state government agencies on key copyright issues, and contributed to modernizing copyright law through the passage of several key pieces of legislation. And I also note that he's a graduate of the University of Rochester, so I'm particularly happy to have him here. And I do note, parenthetically, Todd Carpenter grew up in my district in Greece, New York, in Monroe County. So
Our
we're
next
delighted to be
panel will
well
have a-
represented here.
Our next panel will have a full Wisconsin contingent, may the record reflect.
Melissa Levine is the director of the University of Michigan Libraries Copyright Office, where she brings far-reaching experience in copyright and education. Melissa has worked in a variety of roles in museums and libraries, and currently teaches courses in intellectual property and information law. So Melissa, thank you for being here. Pamela Malpas has worked for decades in the publishing industry as an editor, producer, and literary agent for print and digital publications, a current board member of the Association of American Literary Agents, a nonprofit trade association for industry professionals, and she's a founding member and chair of the association's Copyright Committee, which focuses on education for agents on developments in and threats to copyright. And finally, Professor Jeffrey Sedlick, who has been a professional advertising photographer and commercial director for 37 years. He's the president of the nonprofit Plus Coalition, PLUS, past president of the American Photographic Artists, and a 25-year professor of the Arts Center College of Design in Pasadena, California, teaching courses on copyright law and licensing. Thank you all for being here and be a part of this conversation.
We thank all of our panelists. We're just going to have a bit of an informal dialogue. I have a couple questions I want to ask. I know Mr. Morelli has a few questions, but this is to incite kind of dialogue so we can walk away with a better understanding of the best path to move forward in some of these areas, and to learn a little bit from your experience. And so maybe I'll start by saying the Copyright Public Modernization Committee, of which you're members, was created to facilitate communication between the Copyright Office and groups that rely on the office. We're a handful of years later, and I'd love to get any feedback you have on the effectiveness of the organization in ways that we could look and consider strengthening the committee, or ways that may need to be improved. If anybody wants to start. Keith?
Okay, I think this is on. I see a little red light. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you, Chairman Stile, and Ranking Member Morelli for holding this roundtable, and certainly for inviting us all to participate. In terms of the CPMC, I will tell you that I'm thrilled to be part of the CPMC and hope that the CPMC will continue. I know that it was originally set aside to I think, end after 2 or 3 years or whatever it's been. So we're closing in on that period of time. But I think it's something that should continue. I would like to certainly continue as a member of the CPMC. I'd like to think that the feedback I've given has been helpful in some regard. I know I have found the experience very, invaluable and helpful on my end. It gives me a chance to relay information and concerns directly to the people who are, in charge of modernizing the Copyright Office. So I would, be very much in favor of the CPMC continuing, and like I said, I'd love to continue in the role as well.
Floor's open.
I'll second what Keith said. I think it's been very useful, and I've enjoyed participating in it. I hope it continues, and I think it's provided a valuable role and a valuable opportunity for there to be dialogue between users and the Copyright Office.
Go ahead.
I'll second that as well. Part of the strength of the CPMC is in its diversity. There are subject matter experts who have deep knowledge in their specific areas, and each of us has had the opportunity to participate actively in providing feedback. And as well, the CPMC has been very organized in its presentations to us to make sure that we have information about the advancement of their current projects, and I would encourage the continue to be funded to continue.
Anything we should do to strengthen it, or would you continue the organization as it exists today?
This is our first opportunity to be together in person, so I think more of this would be helpful.
So pulling people together more on a more regular basis.
Literally being able to have more informal conversation. Most of the opportunities that we've had have been through Zoom, and responding to demonstrations from the Copyright Office about the progress.
I'm going to ask you to pull your mic. I can hear you just fine, but I know we're also live streaming this, and just so the cameras pick it up will be helpful.
Where was I? I think that the opportunity to be together in person and have more informal conversation about the kinds of things that my colleagues are raising would be incredibly helpful. And I spent a number of years at the Library of Congress, so one of the things that I'm interested in and excited about is the way in which the Copyright Office is really bridging the interests of copyright as an important creative engine and economic engine, and the long-term national interests associated with the Library of Congress and its collecting activities.
I'll just second, if I can just jump.
Let's make it a dialogue.
I'll just
please.
second what Melissa said. I think that was right on point, and I would love to do that. I know there was earlier today sort of a little tour of the office and stuff. I was not able to participate because I had a conflict, but things like that where we could get together and really kind of a back and forth in a dialogue, and maybe get demos and show us firsthand in person things that are going on. I think that'd be extremely helpful.
Mr. Kell?
It was a little bit of a shock for me to see sort of the technical debt that the Copyright Office had in terms of just the systems that they were trying to put in place to scale to the opportunity. But I was very encouraged by the openness to try to show what was trying to be done, to try to climb out of it. And I think they've done a really good job of that, though I just hope it keeps going. That often modernization is sort of a keyword for leveraging digital technologies as opposed to just passing paper around all the time. And I think they're kind of getting somewhat beyond that, and I think we want to see it go further. So I felt very welcomed to learn what's going on, but they've had to crawl out of a hole, and I think they're doing pretty well.
And building on that, I think it's critical to view this modernization effort as an ongoing work, by the Copyright Office and the Library of Congress, not just for this system, but for all their systems. Maintaining technical infrastructure to support management of copyright information is a ongoing systems development effort. And things are constantly changing, and the ways in which our industry is creating content and distributing content are constantly changing. The need for the Copyright Office to maintain this momentum is critically important.
So I'm just, I guess, to a layperson, which is what I am in this regard, how do you see your role? Do you see within the slice of the industry that you represent, thinking about it from the point of view of people who are going in to get file copyrights and make that easier? What is it that you bring to it, and how you see the interaction between you? And I'd just be curious.
Well, a good example is I'm here today in part on behalf of the American Photographic Artists, and photographers are the smallest of small businesses. Often they have no employees. They go out all day and make photographs. They might make thousands of photographs in a day and pass them along to their client either as they're shooting or at the end of that day or maybe the next day on the outside. They need to get their works registered because they can be infringed immediately. They need an efficient, effective, expedient process for registration with limits that align with, limits as to quantities per registration that align with their actual workflows. They need fast ways to be able to attach to the registration system from within their workflow, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that today. And they need to be able to make sure that their work is registered before it gets out into the world.
And this is fascinating, but if you're a commercial photographer or someone who just doesn't necessarily do it commercially, but may want to copyright work, do commercial photographers typically file for copyright for every single image they produce? Is that typically what they would do?
Well, typically photographers don't register, unfortunately.
Oh.
Because the process, they view the process as mysterious and difficult, and it has been through the paper days and somewhat with the current ECO registration system, and much of that is going to be resolved, we hope, in the new system that's currently under development. But ideally, they would register everything before they deliver it to their client. It's true that you can register within 3 months of first publication and still take advantage of the enhanced benefits in terms of remedies in the event of infringement, but there is no 3-month period of protection for infringement of unpublished works that you might, that a client might see, but that are not necessarily published and get infringed. You need to get those registered before you show them to your client. I teach registration for the last almost 30 years, thousands and thousands of people, and it's my belief that less than 2% of photographers register their works, and we'd like to see that up to 80 and 90%.
But that would be, I mean, I don't know what that is, but would it be safe to say that's billions and billions of images in the course of a single year, no?
So they don't shoot most photographers don't shoot every day, but a photojournalist will go out and shoot 1,000 images in a day or more, and you add
So
that.
am I wrong? Is it not potentially billions of images in a year?
Across all the creators, yes.
Yes.
But those are matters of scale, and actually the quantities of registered images are one of the least significant issues that the Copyright Office faces in its technology infrastructure.
Really? So that doesn't present a problem for them in terms of just the amount of storage space necessary? Because you have to have the image on file, I assume, within the Copyright Office?
They may correct me, or the more technical people on this committee may correct me, but I don't believe so. If it's a scalable system, more and more storage comes online as it's needed.
Gotcha. Yes, Pamela?
Yeah, I'd like to add, I'm here speaking for literary works in copyright, and I shared Jeff's concern about the need for more registrations. There are lots of authors who don't register their work, and as a literary agent, we sit in between the creator of the literary work and the publisher who will acquire those rights. So the remunerative transfer of copyright is the stock in trade of every literary agent. And therefore, we need a copyright system that works. Our business fails to exist if there isn't a copyright system. And the need for more authors to feel comfortable either copywriting their own work, or in many cases that actually falls to the publisher. It's part of the contractual obligation of the publisher to register that copyright. Every book is a small business, every writer is a small business, and most literary agents are small businesses, and the proper functioning of a copyright system is absolutely fundamental to everything we do.
I'm sorry, just as a quick follow-up, as Professor Sedlick said, where in the case of photographers, that they often don't, 2% are I think you said was the number you said roughly.
In my experience from working with groups of people and asking them to raise their hand.
Yeah, okay. Is the same true of, I hope there's a higher percentage of people participating in the literary side, but is that not necessarily true?
You mean in terms of registering?
Correct.
I'd say there is a larger percentage, but there probably is not a lot of unpublished work that is being registered. In those cases, it would be happening primarily by authors rather than publishers.
Right.
And
And now the responsibility primarily rests with the publisher's contractual obligations.
generally, it's a contractual obligation to the publisher.
Thank you.
You go right ahead.
To answer your question about how I see my role, I see my role chiefly as a liaison between the recorded music industry and the Copyright Office. As Jeff and Pamela have sort of alluded to, all the different copyright industries have different issues. They work at different scales, and they're in different media, and different volumes and things like that. And so what goes for one industry doesn't necessarily go for another.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one thing that's been done really well in formulating this committee is there's a diversity of copyright creator groups here. And before each meeting of the committee, I always caucus with my members and find out what's going on with them. Have they been using the pilots? What concerns do they have? What's going well, what's not going so well. And so I think it's an efficient way for the Copyright Office to get feedback and input from a lot of users without having to have, thousands of conversations.
Yeah, and how I see my role, so I'm the CEO of the Copyright Alliance. Of the Copyright Alliance, we represent just about everyone who relies on copyright law for their, for their businesses, for their living, for their careers. So big and small, movie studios, record labels, book publishers, newspapers, magazines, photographers, artists, authors, so on, the whole gamut. And as Susan said, I mean, each individual, each industry has sort of different things. I feel sorry for the Library of Congress and Copyright Office because they have all these different interests coming at them and asking for different things, and it's a really, really hard job. And they're doing yeoman's work, trying to, to try to check everyone's boxes off and still, stay afloat and with all these new complex issues that are coming up every day. So anyway, I think it's sort of an easy way to find out where the copyright industry stands on something is certainly to take the temperature of the Copyright Alliance.
Mr. Kaufman, I think wanted to say.
Well, why don't you, Mr. Kale, and then I want to shift gear. I just want to get through a couple different topics. So go right ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
So as a role, I guess something that I can offer, and I hope that I can, is the, how do you scale just the enormity of the digital opportunity, right? We were talking about, thousands. No, we're talking about a lot of materials that are generated digitally, physically, whatever. How do you go and preserve these materials? How do you provide access to it? How do you register it? How do you do the cataloging? How do you go and keep things accessible? Those are real challenges, and the Copyright Office has a very important role to play, but it's within a larger play. The Library of Congress is scaled to be able to have 28 million books, but that's not enough. The number of petabytes that are generated that want to kind of go through the library structure is enormous. So how do we do that? And thankfully, there's really cost-effective mechanisms of doing this sort of thing at scale. Well, if you go and look at how things have been done during the 20th century, may not be how we want to do things in the 21st century, and I'd like to help.
Let me build on that, because you talked about the IT system. We discussed how photographers or small literary writers aren't registering, and I think we all see the volume that's created. Anybody that's on social media, you just start to understand the depth of the creative talent that's here, but also the volume of work that's created. And the Copyright Office has been working for a handful of years on the enterprise copyright system. Curious of a couple of things. I'll ask a couple of questions, and we'll just kind of get the dialogue moving on it. How involved was this group in that, and in particular in the testing in 2020, 2021? Based on your experience with the new registration system, would you describe it how would you describe its progress of development? And then broadly speaking, is the IT system of the Copyright Office prepared for this modernization push? Or how should policymakers be kind of analyzing and thinking about the work the Copyright Office is doing to modernize? Mr. Kaufman.
Yes, thank you. So, yes, I was consulted. I don't think it was CPMC in the early days, but I think a number of us, met with people who were doing design for the Enterprise Copyright Office and others. So I can't speak for anyone other than myself, but it was definitely a process where we were brought in. In terms of how to think about this, I think Todd said something along these lines. Modernization's sort of a funny word. It almost feels old already. And if you think about that as, modernization feels old, well, modernization doesn't end. If you want to be truly modern, it never ends. It's continuous improvement. The world changes, the technologies change. I mean, remember when you first accessed the internet? It might have been on a floppy disk or searching Gopher Space with Veronica. You need to update things continually for them to be useful. And so I just, and there are things that maybe we can get to that I think could be obvious later phases to sort of address some of these concerns about photographers not registering all their works. And just to add something to what Pamela said, book authors generally do get registrations if they have a publisher. So I'm a book author. My books are registered. But when I write an article and I retain copyright, I write blogs, I retain copyright, and I'm a copyright lawyer. I don't register. It's cumbersome. It's maybe not worth it for me. It's not, and there are reasons I should register, and I know what they are, but I think for the most part, as Brewster's talking about, you have all of these artifacts, all of these new things that are coming out, and certain things get registered, particularly where there's a clear economic value in a contract where someone's responsible for ensuring that economic value. I used to work for a publisher. That's what you do. You ensure the economic value for the author, and this is part and parcel of what you're doing. But when I'm just doing it for myself, I don't always do it. In fact, I haven't done it yet. So this is just some things to keep in mind. Thank you.
Could I ask this will demonstrate my ignorance on this. I have no idea what the process is even like. So let's say I wrote this really fascinating novel about serving in the United States Congress during some crazy time and wanted to copyright that. I know the publisher would normally do it, but if it was self-published and I wanted to copyright it, what's that experience? I don't even know what this is like. Anybody? So I'm paying
It's gotten a lot
an
simpler.
hourly,
In my view, it's gotten a lot simpler with these systems. It is, I don't know this directly, but my sense is it is designed both for people who are in industry that need to register many things and complex artifacts, but I think that it is also designed in a way that an individual with a little bit of patience can register a work like the one that you're describing.
so an average American could just go online and, is that how it
I
works?
think the average 12-year-old today.
Yeah. So just for fun, went into the system last evening and registered a work. It was fairly easy for someone who I know what I'm doing,
Yeah.
but even if you didn't, with some basic information, you can manage your way through, and there's lots of informational, pop-ups for instructions on how to go about doing it for an individual work. Looking forward, though, and this touches on what Jeff was talking about, with people generating more and more content. How many selfies were taken in this room today? There should be a way in which the system should be able to recognize and extract information from the file that's uploaded, which would make the process a lot more simple. There are many ways in which, and I've been a strong proponent on the committee for greater machine interoperability, in which a lot of this information that's stored in these systems is created somewhere else. You recognize, you can set your camera up to say, I am the author, Todd Carpenter, put this information in the information that's stored in the file. And I imagine that would simplify, in many respects, this process if you were uploading hundreds of pictures. And it would probably reduce costs as well.
Go ahead.
So, in registering an individual work like you're talking about, there are still challenges. It's much easier than registering a group of photographs, but you have to know what entity is registering. It might seem simple, but is it you as an individual? Is it your company, your corporation? Or if you're employed by the government, can you even register? Is it a government work? And then you also have to make a determination about what is excluded from the work that you're registering. If there's a painting in the background, if you incorporate works by others, photographs by others, you don't own the copyright in those perhaps. And also you need to make a determination as to whether or not the work is published. And that might seem simple, but oftentimes it's not.
Chairman Stile, you'd asked about what role our committee has had in testing of the systems. And we haven't really taken that role so far. Really, our role has been seeing demonstrations of the systems in development and discussing how that's going and whether things look good. So in terms of practical testing, except what each of us might have done individually or through some other context, we're not really involved in that part. But each of us brings a different set of priorities in terms of which sort of module of the system matters to us. Registration, of course, matters to all of us, and that's sort of the last in the queue. So we haven't actually seen that new system live and in the world and functioning, but that is, the one that we're all probably most interested in seeing functional. And it's a vast improvement on the older system. The recordation system, for some of us, it's not something we think about, and others it is. So I think that's part of the question of whether or not we could be involved in testing these things, because for some of us, some part of the system is not as important as others.
Thank you.
So to answer your question about how involved we are in the testing, I think the answer is yes, and we don't know yet. Yes, because on the recordation system, before it went live, the Copyright Office reached out to us and said, hey, we'd love to test this out. Can you help us out and get some people to help us test this? And we helped them out. We reached out to our members and the creators that we represent and said, here you go, here's some folks that can help out. The not yet part is on the registration part of things, because I don't think that's at a stage yet for us to do that, but I assume that when that time comes, we will be asked the same question. In terms of is the system, how easy it is to use, I have to disagree with Todd and Melissa here. I think it's come a long way in the last few years, there's no doubt, but it still has quite a ways to go. And I know the Copyright Office and the Library of Congress are working feverishly on some of these things, but I think that it still has a ways to go. It needs to be, this new system, when is it in place, needs to be flexible to address user needs for all different type of copyright owners and all different type of copyrighted works. It needs to be easy to navigate, intuitive, and have a consistent interface. And it must accommodate change for future growth, which we all know, as Todd said, is inevitable, is going to happen. And the one thing that frustrates me now, but I'm hopeful, and I don't think it's going to frustrate me in the future, is that we hear like, oh, it would be great if you could do this. And then they go, well, we'd love to do this, but we can't do it because of some issue with the technology. Well, hopefully we don't get that response in the future. Hopefully the technology is being built right now to accommodate all those things I just mentioned and is easily be malleable and flexible to address those new situations as arise. And a lot of the things that we have asked for over the years, whether it's, a dynamic pricing model or something else, hopefully that new system, that will eventually happen.
Can I, and I apologize, I have to run in just a few minutes, so I'm going to almost hate to ask this question, but I mentioned in my opening comments about the the district, DC Circuit Court decision that I understand related to an individual who does print on demand of books that are in the public domain but copyrighted them, and there was a requirement to produce 2 copies for the Library of Congress and the Copyright Office, and the court essentially said it was a taking because there was no government interest in it. Any thoughts on this and how we might address it, or should there be a way to address it by Congress?
Yeah, so there are 2 ways the Library of Congress can get copies of deposits. One is through the copyright registration system under Section 408, and the other, they can make a demand under Section 407. And what happened is in the Valancourt case, what it was issued was at 407. So 408 really doesn't come into play. Copyright Office registrations don't come into play here. But what happened in that case is basically the court said in that particular instance, the way the demand was made was a takings, as you point out. So what that does is, in my view at least, puts strain on the system, on the Section 407 part of the system, and puts more reliance on getting registrations, getting deposits through the Section 408, the ones that come through the copyright registration process. So that's why we need to make registration as easy and as simple and as inexpensive as possible, because now it seems that the library is going to get most of, as it does now, it already gets most of its deposits that way, but it's really going to be reliant in the future on Section 408 deposits.
So in 407, I'm sort of, and I'll admit I know less about the case than I probably should, but why did this come to the attention of the Copyright Office in the first place? I mean, it was an on-demand book. There must have been 1 copy. How would?
Oh no, it was. I don't know the exact number. Around 360 different books.
Oh, gotcha.
They were published on demand, so it's not like they were printed.
So
And they
it's
could just
one
take one off
copy.
the shelf.
Yeah.
It was on demand. This was a little publisher working out of their basement, I believe, or their garage, or something like that.
Yeah.
And this demand was made by the library. And if you don't comply with the demand, you don't lose your copyright protection in the book. And you're right, they were public domain books, but they did have like an introduction that was protected by copyright, and therefore the whole thing was protected. But what happened was the library made a demand, and if you don't comply with that demand, the library can fine you for each demand. I think it's $250. Don't quote me on the number, though. And so that was going to put this publisher out of business, apparently. And that's a concern.
They've had to produce, so even the public domain, they didn't put that under their copyright. I assume they were not able to. It was just the introduction?
Yeah, I believe that was the case. It was they would write introductions to these public domain books, and I believe these public domain books were unavailable out of print. So they were really doing a great service by taking these public domain books, providing some introduction to say why they chose this book and to make available, why it's important, and to make it available. And if that publisher's not around, maybe those public domain books are not available at all.
But in order to restore that, is there some value in thinking about, under certain circumstances, the Library of Congress produce the copies if there's a value in doing it, and just not, again, it's small. There'd have to be it's got to be a narrow number of cases where producing 1 or 2 copies of the thing isn't an undue burden on the producer of the work. Is it under certain circumstances, should we say the Library of Congress just does it at its own cost? Is there
That's a little bit of a dangerous path, giving the Library of Congress, or frankly anyone, not the copyright owner, authority to just make copies. But
Well,
If
no,
the,
I
if the
would-
copyright owner says, look, I can't afford to make the copies,
Yeah.
but I give you permission to do it, then by all means. I don't see why that would be a problem.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was suggesting, not that they do it without permission, but if you're seeking copyright protection, well,
Well, let me just say, you get copyright protection, we probably
by
should have
just
mentioned at the
producing,
beginning.
right.
Yeah, without
Right,
having to
right,
register the work.
right,
So,
right.
and the provision we were talking about also only applies to published works, I should mention.
And one of the unique aspects is the physical copy aspect of this versus the digital, which if we think about photography, print photography as a physical cost, a digital copy of a photo, as we all know, we can text each other 1,000 copies. So it's an interesting aspect as we think about how the modernization moves along. Mr. Kale?
I think you're coming around to one of the key things that I would love to see next for the Copyright Office to do, is to really facilitate digital deposit as part of the registration system, and to scale up the Library of Congress to be able to handle the cataloging, format, preservation, because preservation is so important, and the stuff is ephemeral. The average life of a web page is 100 days before it's changed or deleted. I mean, if you don't get on it right away, it's gone. And even what we've seen out of the Copyright Office modernization hasn't gotten to the digital uploading part. I think that should be part and parcel, and it's not that expensive, would be my, I can tell you from experience.
Ms. Levine?
A few things to follow on what Brewster was saying in terms of digital debt. Collecting these things digitally still is a preservation issue for the future, and so the issue, it's not cost free. It's not like a paper book and a digital book have the same kinds of preservation concerns. And it's that much more complicated when you're talking about an artifact like a sound recording or a film where there are a near infinite number of copyrights embodied in one single thing. The case that you're referring to, the facts are problematic in a lot of ways. And one of the differences between my lens and my colleagues' lens is that, while at a university I'm working with lots of people who are creators and are producers, we're also trying to use things. And one of the benefits of the inquiry of this committee is trying to figure out how to make it reliable and intuitive to be able to make a search about the copyright status something and have a reliable way of knowing who to ask for permission if that's appropriate.
A great comment. Let me take just real quick, as we think about the depository requirement, and I'll kind of ask a handful of questions, but answer as you see fit. When we think about the data security surrounding this, that's a significant concern, I know, to a lot of people. Is the system robust enough? We're always going to be under attack. It's always evolving. How should policymakers think of that in particular? And then, as you brought up, Mr. Kale, is the physical copy concept becoming dated?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to say that in response to Brewster's comment. So security is key. So for my members in the recorded music industry, we have commercial digital partners, Spotify, Apple Music, you've heard of all of them. And there's security requirements in all those licensing agreements. And there's protocols that have been developed. And as the Library of Congress and the Copyright Office moves into a digital deposit world, they're going to eventually have libraries of sound recordings that are equivalent and maybe even better, because they go backwards in time further, as to our digital partners. And so my members feel strongly that the security protocols in place should be every bit as good at the Library of Congress as they should be at Spotify. And to circle back to one of the issues we talked about, one of the complicating factors that the Library of Congress and Copyright Office has to deal with is we're a bunch of different industries and have different needs and protocols. And so what sound recordings want and need for security might be different than what the movie industry wants or what the book industry wants, and that's expensive. And so one thing I'll put a plug in for the library and the Copyright Office is they need money to fund these security undertakings. And the other thing I would say along those lines is that my members are very willing to meet with the library and the Copyright Office to talk to them about their security concerns and what sort of protocols they'd like to see put in place.
Scott, go ahead.
There's standard federal data standards that basically all contractors and the government does. It's plenty. The key thing I would suggest is the role that the Library of Congress plays of preservation and access. I mean, fundamentally, it's the Library for Congress. And they're building this collection of mandatory deposits, as well as copyright registrations and everything that goes into their collections to try to preserve and create a better democracy. And I think the information that is produced by our key industries that are so important to Americans everywhere should be secured by the Library of Congress for the long-term preservation and access to make sure that things are leveraged as best we can for our country. So the security is, there are already federal mandates. It's then how do we make these things accessible in such a way that they can be used to try to figure out what is under copyright or not? I mean, it's very, very difficult. And if it's all locked up, that won't necessarily serve even the industries that are represented here.
Maybe start here, we'll come here and go down. Go ahead, Pamela.
I would just agree with what Susan was saying about the necessity for security. I think many publishers and indeed authors who may be depositing materials as part of the copyright registration process would love to be able to do it all digitally. It's less cost for postage, it's less concern about materials getting lost somewhere. It's just a simpler thing all around. It does raise questions about, when you call the digital file finished, which is a moving target. Unlike when you have the printed book is finished and you know you have the finished copy. The digital copy can change every time. And but getting back to the security issue, the ease of making digital deposits is wonderful, but there's not anyone who makes those digital deposits who doesn't cross their fingers and hope and pray that what they would submit would be secure, because as people may have seen in the case of the manuscript thief who got so much attention in the New York Times and elsewhere, this fellow working in publishing who was taking manuscripts, many of them pre-publication, that was an enormous source of concern in the publishing industry. The security of digital material is, we like to hold on to our material until we're absolutely sure it's secure.
Yeah, I just want to say what Brewster refers to as information. My members produce information. At least I will speak for my members. I find a little offensive what I like to call creativities that our members do for the public to enjoy, to be entertained, to be informed, to be educated. But in terms of your security issue, let me mention something to supplement what Susan said. I agree with everything she says, of course, but there's one issue about TPMs, right? That a lot of the copyrighted works have TPMs attached to them when they go out into the world to be sold or licensed or whatever the case may be. But when you register the work, the TPMs have to be, they're not included with the work. And then that work is then transferred to the library, is transferred to the library. And so we have some concerns with some of the library practices for physical works that we are told won't apply in the digital world, but we're not that confident about that. One of those, for instance, is the fact that the library asks for the best edition of pretty much everything. They don't need the best edition of everything, and so what they decide they don't need, they donate or give away, or maybe they throw away, okay? Now, we're not too happy about that when it comes to a physical copy, but when it comes to electronic copy and you're transferring a donated copy that is not protected by TPM, I mean, that is as scary as October 31st is, right? I mean, that is so that's something that we need some assurances that isn't going to happen into the future.
I'll say September 30th is a scary date here, so let me shift gears. Because that is our funding deadline, and not lost, I think, on almost anybody in the room. And if I can just shift onto fees. And as we think about the structure of funding, this is probably a third rail in some ways. We can compare and contrast how trademarks, patent office has a different approach than the copyright office. How should we be thinking about it, and how do your members and producers think about this? Or how should the Library of Congress think about this? As we talk about the IT upgrades that are constantly being needed, these developments that you would all like to see, how should we think about it?
We'd like to see a subscription-based registration where creators can purchase a subscription and pay a certain amount and register against their subscription allowances. We'd like to see tiered pricing levels based on quantities of registrations. I will say, however, that the photographers and other creators who are most prolific in terms of the quantity of works that they produce might also be among those who earn the least amount per year through their work. So we have to be careful about basing fees on the quantity of works that are registered, and perhaps base it on quantity of registrations.
Yeah, I mean, everyone would rather pay less than more, so that's sort of the obvious statement. But when you think about fees, it should be a function of ease and cost, right? So if we can have a truly modern system that brings costs down and makes registration easier, then fees could theoretically come down. And again, I'm sort of going back to what Todd was getting to with sort of machine interoperability, and kind of related. I mean, the point I wanted to make is I do business development. You bring your business, and if your business is getting people to register, you bring it where your clients or your prospective clients are. You don't always expect them to come to you. So in these industries, we have metadata standards, we have registries, we have, for images, there's a registry that Jeff runs. For music, there's a works registry. There are many more works registered in a year than are registered for copyright. Books, we have ISBNs, same thing. If through APIs, when someone is registering an ISBN, which is absolutely necessary for commerce in the book business, you could also register a copyright registration and do that digitally, because you're already putting in metadata and information, and it's information that would enable someone who wants to get a license or wants to transact rights to find you. You can do that. Hopefully you can bring costs down because you have an open system. And even, the joke about if you want to get a registration, you need to hire a lawyer. Well, that's not true. But if you do hire a lawyer, and I know lawyers who do this, that's a couple $100, so that's a cost on top of the registration fee. And the more you can do to bring registration into existing current workflows that exist, that are robust, the more you can bring down the friction, and if you bring down friction, maybe you can bring down registration costs, or maybe you don't even bring down registration costs, but you make it so easy that it happens, so now it's just a fee. It's very simple. So that's what I was sort of thinking on fees.
We have just a couple minutes left.
I'm just glad to hear nobody's suggesting that there be fee for access, that basically access to this database and in bulk should be free. That way people will be encouraged to use it. So pay to put in, free to go out.
So while that might be the case, there's 2 points I wanted to make just about funding. One is that since registration is not mandatory, any increase in fees could result in fewer registrations, which means less data to the Library of Congress and less deposits to the Library of Congress as well for the Copyright Office. So it might be sort of self-defeating there. And then the other is ultimately it's the public that is the beneficiary of the ownership information and the deposit copies that make its way to the Library of Congress. And so the funding of the Copyright Office and the copyright system really should be a shared burden, not only from copyright owners who are registrants, but also of users of the system.
Well, I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists for coming and engaging in the conversation with Ranking Member Morelli and I. I think there's a big opportunity here as we look towards the modernization of copyright, and one of the reasons for that is the important role it plays in not only the U.S. economy with the jobs, small businesses in many ways. Many of these individuals on the creative side are entrepreneurs living in Wisconsin and all across the country. But also on a global stage, the U.S. is really the driver in so much creative production. And we're the beneficiaries of being the country that houses that, and getting the Copyright Office operating in a modern capacity, I think, is a huge opportunity. And I also just want to say thank you to so many of the staff members on Committee on House Administration, both from the minority staff and the majority staff. It's not every day in Congress where the minority and the majority can come together to try to really substantively and meaningfully address an issue. This is a nice reprieve from what will probably take place throughout the rest of the week in some ways. But in a serious sense, I think this is an issue that I would really call nonpartisan. It's really how do we make the government work on behalf of the creators and on behalf of all the jobs that are dependent on this, and finding that opportunity to work to modernize the Copyright Office, make sure that it's working on behalf of all of us, the American people, is a project that really transcends political lines, and I appreciate the work of Ranking Member Morelli, and I'd say this to his face too. I appreciate the work of Ranking Member Morelli. I kid. But appreciate the work that he and his staff have done in allowing us to engage in this conversation, and we look forward to having additional conversations about ways that we can work to really modernize the Copyright Office. So thank you all for being here. I know there's some refreshments, and so you don't have to leave, but we conclude today. Thank you.